Yeah, it's seen. Oh, why is it not working now?
So saying there's no signal.
I mean, we're at the College of ICT. Maybe somebody has hacked something. I don't know.
This one's on, right? Yeah. This is the problem, is it? Oh, yeah, okay, that's it. Yeah. So this one goes into those.
Yes, now we can see it. At least it gave time to the people just coming in. Karibu sana. For those who are just coming in. Okay, Karibu Rob.
I sent Julia and Barisa Sabui that it's a great pleasure for me to be here today. I'm not sure this is actually. Oh, we lost it again. God. Okay, so what I was going to talk about today is to talk about the World Bank experience in doing telephone surveys. So, you know, following the onset of COVID-19 in, say, March 2020, there was a sudden need by policymakers for data on the impact of the pandemic and the mobility restrictions. So there was a lot of demand from policymakers all over the world. How can we get these data? We can no longer do face-to-face surveys. How do we get data on who is impacted, how that differs between population groups, how this differs between different parts of the country, how this differs between men and women, etc., and sort of what sectors, what economic sectors are affected. So following the shock, you see policymakers were at a great need of data, yet there were no data at all because we couldn't go to the field to collect data. Statistics offices were all up in arms. What do we do now? How can we get these data out quickly? And so the World Bank worked with many statistics offices around the world to start collecting these data through phone surveys. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about what was done and what was found and how you, and sort of what the pitfalls are, what issues we run into, right? Okay, we lost the slides again.
Yani kweli nimeshindwa yani.
Yeah, there we are. Great. Thank you. Thank you, Julia. So this is about experience in using phone surveys for rapid monitoring of shocks, and using the example of post-COVID telephone surveys. Okay, next slide. So there was a sudden explosion of phone data, of telephone surveys across the world, interviewing households and interviewing firms on the impacts of COVID-19 pandemic, and sort of getting those data out in real time. So we conducted surveys in more than 100 countries. Every survey lasts, say, about 4 to 8 weeks, and they were conducted every 2 to 3 months. And so we were asking questions on socioeconomic impacts, coping strategies, income losses, and policy responses. And so, as I was saying, the surveys allowed for comparisons across groups, men, women, rural, urban, different parts of the country, and different sectors of the economy. Okay, next slide. And so you see the surveys were done almost all over the world. So blue was saying only household surveys, and green is both households and firms were interviewed. And you can see Tanzania is green. So in Tanzania we used a firm survey, we used a firm to interview enterprises, and we worked with NBS, National Bureau of Statistics, to conduct a survey among households. Next one. Across the world, so you see there was a widespread impact on jobs and incomes, but this varied across countries. In this chart you see on the horizontal axis you see GDP per capita, so richer countries are on the right, and the vertical axis is income losses, proportion of households reporting income losses. And so the ones that are most affected are on the top. So you see the richer the country, the less they were impacted in terms of proportion of people reporting income losses. So that was an important finding, showing really the poorer countries were particularly affected. And here you can see which sectors, these are the countries, which sectors reported people will stop working. And you see the blue part is the service sector. So clearly the service sector was very much affected in many countries where a lot of people had to stop working. And so you see some of the findings here, that 33% stopped working, 52% reported wage income losses, and 62% of households reported total income losses. And particularly informal household businesses were affected. Okay, next slide. And so the findings were able to inform various policy responses, right? So in Zambia, for example, the data informed the social cash transfer program, and in Bangladesh, it informed the program to advance informal sector employment. So you see these phone data being very relevant in many places to inform the policy responses by government. And so this was a quite interesting experience, showing that these data can actually be very useful to help people and to design programs to cushion these shocks that they were facing. Next slide. So in Tanzania, the NBS designed a high-frequency welfare monitoring survey as well. This was nationally representative, conducted by NBS and OCGS in Zanzibar. The sample was 2,704 households in the first round. You can see the number of households slightly reducing over time, which is almost inevitable, some households dropping out. But there were 3 rounds. In fact, we've done 4 rounds so far. So the sample was drawn from households in earlier face-to-face surveys. All right, so NBS does face-to-face surveys every year. There's different types of household surveys. So they use a sample frame for those surveys to start calling households. Those households that had a telephone in those face-to-face surveys had their phone number collected. So they had a database from households and their phone numbers, and so that sample used in the earlier face-to-face surveys was used to draw a sample from households that had phones and for which the phone number was available. And so that was able to, that could be done quite quickly. Sorry, previous one. Yeah, so there were 4 domains: Dar es Salaam, other urban, rural, and then Zanzibar. They were conducted every 2 months in last year, in 2021. And each survey lasts around 25-30 minutes. It's a maximum you can do, because by that time the household is getting bored and wants to move on to do something else. So you can only have a limited set of questions, actually. And of course, you can only interview the person that picks up the phone. Usually we try to interview the head of household. And so if that person is not there, usually we try and call back. But we only interview 1 person per household. The costs are about $8 to $10 per interview. Okay, next slide. And so here's some of the findings. This is from, these are 3 bars. So the first one is January 20, and then the second is February, March 2021, and the third is April, May 2021. So see the first bar, the purple one, is pre-COVID, and then the other ones are post-COVID. So you can see, for example, at the national level, the proportion that was working in February, March 2021 was 6% lower than in January 2020. But this is 13 months after the pandemic, right? So don't forget, we didn't do the survey immediately after the pandemic started. So if we'd done this, say, in 3 months after the pandemic, when the country was in lockdown, we would have probably seen different numbers. So I think probably by this time, the country was already recovering. And you can see when we did the survey a month later, many of the proportion of people working had gone up above pre-COVID levels, except, as you can see, in Dar es Salaam, and except for women. But this is people working, right? But the other question, of course, is if people are still working, do they still have their incomes? And many households saw their incomes drop in Tanzania as well. Okay. So this is an example of a finding. Next slide. But of course, the issue with phone surveys is not so straightforward. There are some problems, right? So I want to talk a little bit about the issues. If you use these phone surveys to inform policy, you have to be sure they are representative, or at least be clear what they are representative of, right? First of all, the samples of phone surveys are often not nationally representative. Okay? Because, why is that? Well, it's because phone ownership is not 100%, right? And it's biased towards the non-poor. So I guess the poorest 10-20% doesn't have a phone. So that's a problem. When you do your survey, you miss out those. Here's an example, right? So this is some work we did. I think this is not Tanzania, but you see, I think this is in Ethiopia, but you see, this is the poverty rate, and those with the cell phone, and those with, if you include those with the cell phone, those without cell phone and those with the cell phone have very different poverty rates. So poverty rates are higher among those with no cell phones. You see, so there's a bias towards there's a bias there. So you need, how do you solve that? You need to re-weight the sample. And how do you do that? You increase the weights for underrepresented households, right? And you reduce, you increase the weights for underrepresented households, and you reduce the weights for overrepresented populations, so that you can balance the sample. And then you can, different re-weighting techniques can be done. One of them is, for example, is propensity score weighting. Okay, next slide. And here's an example of how re-weighting can help. I mean, if you see, for example, The first column here is the Ethiopia Socioeconomic Survey 2018, and the second sample is the household phone survey. And you see, for example, household size is 4.8 in the national face-to-face survey, the real survey, so to speak. But the phone survey showed a household size that was much larger, 5.6. You see, or the literacy rate was 41% in the face-to-face survey, but 62% in the phone survey. So you can see you have a bias towards the literate, towards the better off, the better educated, because those are the people with the phone. So you need to reweight, and reweighting can help, because you see the third column shows the proportion in the telephone survey after the reweighting was done. If you look at literacy, for example, it became 0.41% again after reweighting, and household size became very close to what it was, actually exactly the same. In some cases it didn't work, like for food insecurity, the reweighting didn't work so well. The numbers came out very different. So you can see that the reweighting can do a lot to make your survey nationally representative if you do it in a smart way. So there's a way to do it. And in fact, Julia can also talk to you about this. Huh?
1 minute.
1 minute. Okay, let me go quickly. So this is problem number one is the bias in the sample. Problem number two is that you have a good representation. Can everybody see? Just trying to move it a bit. So you can see the survey is overrepresents household heads, right? Because you only interview the household, you don't get good data on the spouses or on the children in particular. So the phone surveys are good to get household outcomes, but not very good to get individual outcomes. Okay, next slide. And so, for example, if you measure employment, you find that employment gets to be overestimated because you only interview the household head, right? And if you think all the household heads represent the whole country, then you overestimate employment, because many people, say the spouses or the adult children in the household are not interviewed, and they may be less likely to be employed. So that leads to another bias. But is this a problem? It is, to the extent that if you measure changes, we find that employment changes and gender disparities appear to be reasonably well estimated. So these high-frequency phone surveys, they can generate useful information, even on individual outcomes, if you focus on changes. Right? You do the phone survey after a month and another month, and then you can see the differences, and those data seem to be quite consistent and reliable. Okay? Next one. And so just to summarize that this is some example from, just to end by saying, these phone surveys really have a lot of potential to inform policymakers almost in real time on these impacts of shocks. This is from Kenya, for example, where they show the impacts of COVID-19 on households on an online dashboard. And so these KenyaCOVIDtracker.org, they show almost real time the various indicators by subgroups or by country on a map. And in charts, this, for example, is the proportion of children with access to teachers. And so you see this went down after the lockdown, and it went up again after the lockdown was ended, and it went down again. So you see, almost in real time, you can see other children in school. Within a week, you can get a dashboard to policymakers. Where are the children not in school? What's happening? And it's the same with our people. So are children involved in learning activities, for example? They're not in school, but are they learning anything? You can almost get a real-time dashboard through these phone surveys. So it's a very powerful instrument still. Yeah. Next one. And so the way to do this is to have a really well-designed sample and then put in place some automated processes. Right? So what they did in Kenya, they divide the sample into weekly representative subsamples. You stick to the random order and you ensure follow-up calls are happening within the same week. Then the enumerators upload their data at the end of each workday, and daily monitoring dashboards are then used to check data quality and immediately fix them. You have a data code pipeline to anonymize and clean the raw data and immediately create some indicators, and then the data can be uploaded on the dashboard with one click, and then immediately it goes to the dashboard. So these things, this Kenya experience, for example, is quite interesting, showing the power of this instrument. Okay, so this was just to give you an idea of the experience we've had with phone surveys across various countries in the world. And so perhaps this is an interesting way to kick off your day. Thank